Meet Charlie. Ask almost anyone what SpaceX does, and you'll probably hear the same answer. They build rockets. Maybe they'll mention Elon Musk. Maybe Mars. Maybe those spectacular launches that flood social media every few weeks. And honestly, they'd only be telling half the story. Because somewhere along the way, SpaceX quietly stopped being just a rocket company. The rockets were never the destination. They were the delivery trucks. Every launch put another piece of something much larger into orbit. Something that, today, millions of people rely on without ever thinking about it. Today, SpaceX launches satellites, connects remote towns through Starlink, carries astronauts to the International Space Station, launches military payloads, supports emergency communications after natural disasters, and keeps thousands of businesses connected every single day. None of those things feel related, until they all disappear at once. So let's imagine something that sounds impossible. Not forever, not even for a week, just one day. For the next 24 hours, every SpaceX rocket stays on the ground. Every Starlink satellite goes silent. Every SpaceX service simply stops. What happens next is far bigger than almost anyone realizes. Let's start with the most obvious one. Starlink. Today, millions of people use it every single day. Families living far from cities. Farmers. Scientists. Travelers. Entire villages that were never connected to traditional internet. For many of them, SpaceX isn't a backup. It's the only connection they have. But homes are only a tiny piece of the puzzle. Commercial airlines use Starlink to keep passengers connected at 35,000 feet. Cargo ships crossing the Pacific depend on satellite internet where no cellular network exists. Cruise ships. Offshore oil platforms. Research stations in the Arctic. The further you get from civilization, the more likely SpaceX is quietly keeping you online. Now imagine a natural disaster. Hurricanes knock down power lines. Wildfires destroy communication towers. Earthquakes wipe out local networks. One of the first things emergency teams often deploy isn't another cell tower. It's a Starlink terminal. Because when everything else fails, satellite internet is often the last thing still standing. Now remember, we're only talking about internet. The world doesn't suddenly go offline. Google still works. Netflix still streams. Your phone still has signal. But underneath the surface, thousands of small failures begin happening at exactly the same time. And that's only the beginning. Because the next systems depending on SpaceX aren't used by ordinary people at all. But losing internet isn't what keeps governments awake at night. The bigger problem is space itself. Today, whenever NASA wants to send astronauts to the International Space Station, there's a good chance they're riding aboard a SpaceX spacecraft. For years, that wasn't the case. Multiple companies competed for those missions. Today, the list has become much shorter, and astronauts are only one piece of the equation. Every year, dozens of satellites need to reach orbit. Weather satellites, communications satellites, scientific missions, national security payloads. If SpaceX suddenly stopped launching, those missions wouldn't magically move to another rocket. They'd simply start piling up. You might think another launch company could simply take over. But rockets aren't like rental cars. You can't just book the next one online. Every launch vehicle has years of testing, strict government certification, limited manufacturing, and an already packed schedule. Even if another company wanted to help, there simply aren't enough rockets waiting on the launch pad. And that's when the real problem appears. Space isn't just about exploration anymore. It's the invisible layer supporting life back on Earth. Delay enough launches, and weather forecasting becomes harder. Communications projects slow down. Scientific research gets pushed back. National security missions wait in line. The rockets may never leave the atmosphere. But the consequences certainly do. And if that's what happens after just one day, Imagine what 6 months would look like. Here's the part most people never see. Rockets are exciting, but they only work for a few minutes. After every launch, the real business begins. Thousands of satellites now circle Earth every single day. They never land. They never sleep. They're constantly moving above our heads, quietly connecting the world. Those satellites aren't just providing Wi-Fi. They connect aircraft flying over oceans, ships crossing entire continents, communities with no fiber cables, scientists working in Antarctica, emergency teams responding to disasters, even military units operating thousands of miles from home. Most people never notice the network because it's working exactly as intended. Now imagine that network suddenly goes quiet. Not because every satellite falls out of the sky, but because they simply stop communicating. One interruption isn't catastrophic. Neither is 10. But as thousands of tiny connections disappear, the effects begin spreading everywhere, not as one giant blackout, but as countless small failures happening all at once. That's the strange thing about infrastructure. You rarely notice it while it's working. You only notice it when it isn't. Roads, power grids, water systems, and now, orbital networks. SpaceX didn't just build another technology company. It built something much harder to replace. An invisible layer of modern civilization. And that raises an uncomfortable question. What happens when one private company owns so much of it? By now, the pattern should be obvious. SpaceX doesn't just operate in one industry. It touches communications, transportation, defense, scientific research, emergency response, and space exploration. One company, sitting quietly at the center of an enormous web. And that's what makes this thought experiment so interesting. The real danger isn't that civilization suddenly collapses. It won't. The danger is that replacing everything SpaceX does wouldn't take 24 hours. It wouldn't take 24 weeks. In some areas, it could take years. That's what happens when critical infrastructure grows faster than meaningful competition. For decades, governments tried to avoid relying on a single supplier. Competition creates resilience. If one company stumbles, another can step in. But space has evolved differently. Today, one company launches more rockets, deploys more satellites, and provides more commercial space services than anyone else. That's an incredible achievement. But it also creates a new kind of vulnerability. So, what happens if SpaceX goes offline for just 24 hours? Probably less than the headlines would make you believe. But that was never the real question. The real question is, how much of tomorrow depends on one company continuing to work exactly as expected? Because history shows us that every generation builds infrastructure so reliable. People stop noticing it's there. Until one day, they do. And maybe that's the biggest story SpaceX has ever written. Not the rockets that leave Earth, but the invisible systems that keep it connected. Every generation builds something so useful. It slowly becomes invisible. Roads, railways, electricity, the internet. At first, they're exciting new inventions. Eventually, they're simply expected to work. Space may be following the very same path. Except, this time, much of that infrastructure belongs to a single private company. That's what makes SpaceX different. It isn't just selling launches. It's operating pieces of the modern world. And every successful mission, every new satellite, every additional customer, makes that network just a little more valuable and a little harder to replace. None of this means competition disappears. Companies around the world are building new rockets, new satellites, and new launch systems. But catching the leader isn't just about building a better rocket anymore. It's about recreating an entire ecosystem. Launches, manufacturing, satellites, ground stations, software, customers, decades of experience. That's a much taller mountain to climb. So, what happens if SpaceX goes offline for just 24 hours? We might notice a few interruptions. Governments would scramble. Businesses would adapt. Engineers would get to work. But perhaps the most important thing we'd discover isn't how much we'd lose. It's how quietly SpaceX became woven into everyday life. Not through a single breakthrough, but one launch, one satellite, and one mission at a time. Sometimes history doesn't change all at once. Sometimes it changes one successful launch at a time.